Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome to today's episode of Qualified Opinion. Joining me is Nancy French, a New York Times bestselling ghost author and the author of the deeply moving memoir, Ghosted, An American Story. Nancy, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me on. This is so fun.
So I usually ask, my first question is like, tell me how you got there. Tell me what your professional path is, which is kind of a weird question to ask someone who just wrote a memoir, and we're going to be talking about this memoir. But nonetheless, can you tell us like the big line of your professional path and how you got where you are?
Yeah. So I went to college, dropped out of 3. I majored in various things, never graduated, got married to a rank stranger.
Yeah.
And moved to New York.
For our listeners, she's married to David French at the New York Times, previously at the Dispatch and National Review and Fire and all of that.
Yeah, and he's amazing. I call him a rank stranger because we got married very quickly and everyone was opposed to it. So I married David, and then we just lived for, just quite well. We had not a normal life, but we lived. I had 2 kids. Stayed home with them, sent them to kindergarten. And then after they started going to school, because I didn't have a degree, I did a bunch of jobs. I sold bicycles. I worked at the Huddle House. I worked at a catering company. But eventually I loved storytelling. So I started writing, and I started writing unsuccessfully for a long period of time. But eventually I became a ghostwriter, and I got like 5 New York Times bestsellers through that process, which is a very modest way to achieve success, because they were buying the books because of my celebrities, not because I was so fantastic.
Yeah, but if the writing had been crappy, they would not have bought the book.
Maybe.
No one, and I believe in the market, and unless, the publishing market or the ghostwriting market is really, really different. It means that, once you write the first, you've established yourself to writing others. If they rehire you, you must be doing something right.
Well, I love storytelling, and it was an honor for me to be able to do that, because as you can imagine, going from working at the bicycle store to having 5 New York Times bestsellers, that's a pretty good trajectory. But during that ghost process, I wrote for so many GOP politicians, but simultaneously, my husband, David French, came out as Never Trump. So I was frequently in these really awkward situations where I had these Trump advocates as my clients. So I would be at MAGA rallies or on, Trump's campaign plane, and they would be talking about David French right in front of me, not realizing that I was related to him. It's just like so funny. And I realized this is not what I need to do. So I switched. I became an investigative journalist about 3 years ago, did that for a while. And then I decided almost at 50 years old to write my own book. And that's what Ghosted is.
And Ghosted, the title has a double meaning. Obviously, it's a reference to your career as a ghostwriter, but it's also a reference to, I think you would say, the way you were ghosted by the political class when you guys came out as Never Trumper. But I think it's a recurring theme in the book with Conrad ghosted you. I mean, I think there's just kind of, it is a theme that still runs through the entire book. So let's start by the beginning. I mean, I was telling you before we started this, like when I was reading this book, which is the story of your life so far, I was just baffled by how much you have gone through and how much you've survived. And all I knew of you really before I picked up this book was that you were David's wife, that you guys had a very strong marriage, and that you were a person that I would always see smiling. Now, what you show up on the outside is one thing, but that said, the image I had of you, and then I'm reading this book, and it talks about your poor beginning in the Appalachians, in the mountain of Kentucky, and then it talks about sexual abuse at the hands of a young pastor in your vacation Bible school, right? You were Church of Christ. So it means that you were going to church a lot, three times
Right.
a week, right? And then it goes on after semi catastrophe. Your best friend dies. It's just, and I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, this smiling person that I see on Twitter, that I see around, it's just like, it was stunning to me how much you have survived. So can you tell us why you decided, what inspired you to write this book now, and why this book?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm 49. I'll be 50 this year. And I feel like I've been hiding behind everybody else's stories as a ghostwriter because I love to tell stories. I love to write, but I've never written my own. I have written. Winston Churchill has a great quote that says something like, I'm the writer of rare books. I just never intended them to be rare. I have written part of my story before, but like the books didn't really sell. I don't think that I was emotionally ready to do it. I feel like age and maturity is really beneficial to like the reflection on your life. And back in the day when I was in my 30s writing about my book, I didn't have the perspective that I needed or the emotional healing. I could never have written about any of this stuff. I mean, I barely had even talked about some of it. And so I think that's one of the benefits of getting older is being able to look back and have more of a gestalt view of like what you've been through. And I don't know, there's just so much healing there. So this book is not like a policy book. And it's not like anything I've ever written before because it's just my story. So I'm not trying to convince people to switch partisan alliances. I don't even know. I'm confused about my own, So it's just my story without making political points necessarily, though it's all sort of interwoven. But yeah, I just decided I wanted to actually tell my story and to quit hiding behind other people's. And it was very empowering and terrifying.
That's one of the things that, so we read this book and we read about your family. We read about, like the oddity, their oddity in every family, but yours is poor and it has a box with a Ku Klux Klan robe and funny people in the family. Your uncle seems to be quite a character. And then we discover, it's really early on in the book, your story of sexual abuse. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I went to the Church of Christ and was there 3 times a week. I loved it. It was my cultural and social hub, like everybody that I knew was there in my community. We were always the last people to leave. And I loved it so much. I loved God so much, still do. But at the time, when I was a kid during vacation Bible school, my vacation Bible school teacher, who was also a preacher, abused me. He was about 10 years older than me.
And you were 12.
Right. And so
a baby.
That's complicated my relationship with church because I wanted to go to church, but that guy was there and he held court over, all of my friends. And so I just sort of slinked away and started smoking cigarettes, outside on, like I would walk during Sunday school instead of go to Sunday school. And, that at 12, that's not a good trajectory, but that's how I sort of dealt with the yuck of that. And it took me very many years. I'm still unraveling that, honestly.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that is really interesting about the book. It's like we know about this early on in the book, but then we see you deal with it so much later, so many years later. And in part, it seems, and I wonder what you think about this, it seems that it's because the entire incentive structure and human nature pushes everything down, pushes all of these experiences down. There's secrets. And especially in the church, I never realized this until you write it, is that there was the message that you were given about purity, about sexuality, about the value and the virtue of preserving yourself, made it, basically put the burden on you and made it seems impossible for you to actually talk about any of this because you'd become tainted by every message you were getting during the day. You were tainted. And I just never realized that on one hand, it's great to get this message, but it's counterproductive. It's really terribly destructive in
Right.
for kids who go through what you went through.
Well, it's the opposite of the gospel, because in church, you always hear, oh, you've gotten involved in sin. That's okay. That's not who you are. That's not who you were designed to be. God can forgive you. Like that's the message you hear in every good sermon across the South and Tennessee, on Sunday morning is you're better than that. That's not who you were designed to be, unless it deals with the sexual issue. And then it's like, oh, so you've already been ruined. Oh, and you're 12. Well, that's too bad. You had a good run. It's like, oh my gosh, like it's not even true. Additionally, the problem is the secrecy that you mentioned. The secrecy is so heavy. So if you're abused by a pedophile in the church and anyone finds out, this is the message that you hear. You cannot tell anybody this because you don't want people to start doubting the gospel, the message of the church. Now imagine what you're putting on a kid's shoulders, the salvation of the community. So in your secrecy lies the salvation of all these people. So you better keep your mouth shut. I mean, it's terrifying and horrible. And so I grew up duplicitous because I was hiding everything. And that's just the thing.
And of course, that guy, Conrad, he was telling you that you couldn't tell anything. So you weren't, and it took you a long time to even realize that this actually was sexual abuse. I mean, you thought he loved you. You thought, which is a great tool of predator, especially for younger people. And you were basically told, like, don't say anything, but you were having this message reinforced all the time. Because I mean, the message about sin should be applying to him, not to you, right? I mean, there's a place for actually talking about sin and how there's still a place for sinners. But it seemed that basically the burden was put on you,
right?
In part in your isolation. But because of what, I don't know, it was just really terrifying to read this for me, because I wondered how many young people right now are going through this. And you, in your own work, obviously, you have investigated sexual abuse in the church. And how many young people go through this and basically have the same experience you have, which is one, they don't even know, they don't even realize that they're a victim of sexual abuse. And yet as adults, they're going to have to deal with it. And the entire structure is putting the burden on them.
That's right. And I realized that I later in my maturity went back to my hometown church and sort of talked to them about like, what is going on? What did you know? What was actually happening? Why was I abused by my vacation Bible school teacher? Why was he allowed to be my vacation Bible school teacher? And it was so much more terrifying than I thought it was, because they did know that I had been abused and there were 15 other victims.
Yeah.
And he just ran ramshackle through the whole congregation.
And that's really at the end of the book where you have that conversation with the pastor of the church of your hometown that you really, really loved, and who tells you, yeah, he knew it. And then in addition to the burden of feeling impure because of that relationship that you've had, you also carried a lot of guilt because you know of a mother of your friend who gotten raped by him, right?
Right. And you know what? She actually was not raped, but it was stopped. So it was an attempted rape. But he at least attempted to rape. I know of 3 attempted rapes just from my cursory investigation, And so anyway, he's still out there. I get pictures of him all the time, and people, he's around vulnerable people groups to this day, but it's very,
but you've managed so you thought he had been arrested, and then you discovered he hadn't. And then he was teaching at a high school. I can't remember what he was doing, but you managed, right? You managed to present evidence that got him to lose his job effectively, right? To not be around children.
Yes, and that's the best way to put it. The real way is I managed to produce evidence, and the entire school principal, police officer, HR resource officer laughed at me, said they didn't believe me, said it was a he said, she said thing. Only then did I present the evidence, because by this point, I'm old enough to know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I presented evidence that was a huge threat of litigation. And I was like, here's letters from all of these people who were abused by your girls' basketball coach. Here's a letter from the church that stipulates that he had abused me. Anyway, I left all that there. And the guy voluntarily resigned within the week. But they treated me so terribly. And I like, for some reason, like at the time I was like bawling my eyes out and, like crying in a very inelegant way in the parking lot. But I'm very thankful I had that experience, because I feel like that is how sexual abuse victims are always treated. And it doesn't matter if you're 12 and poor and live down by the lake like I did, or you're a New York Times bestselling author who's also an investigative journalist. They treat you the same. They don't believe you. They stigmatize you. They try to shame you out of speaking up. But I'm old enough where that didn't work.
So that's another theme in the book, where you talk about basically how prone people are to try to protect the institution before they would even move the finger to protect the victims, or even the weak and the poor and people that the institutions should be protecting. So for instance, it's also like the story of your political rebellion against Trump, effectively, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I was always a political ghostwriter. So I was the type of person who would help people shape their opinions on immigration or whatever for a million different GOP politicians. And then when David French and I, my husband and I, were talking about the developments of what was going on when Trump came down the escalator, we were so alarmed that we realized that we could not go along with our party, even though we grew up as conservatives. I grew up with Ronald Reagan posters on my wall. And so that is when everything sort of fell apart for me occupationally, because I was a ghostwriter for the GOP. And so the GOP, in my opinion, was very much like the church. You were talking about institutional responsibility. So institutions have a responsibility to honor their original like founding purpose. So if you're a church, your founding purpose should be obvious, to glorify God. If you're a Christian camp, that should probably be obvious. If you're a political party, you have platforms and values that literally you write it down, you create a platform. Yeah. And so, but what happens?
Not so much recently.
Yeah, not so much recently. And so, but what happens is when something happens and the institution is threatened, they circle the wagons not to protect their original founding purpose, but rather just to protect their very existence. And so when that happens, like, for example, with the church, like if there's a bad guy at the church and you don't know what to do about it and you don't want people to find out about it because you don't want to embarrass the church. So you decide to elevate your brand management over your original purpose. Or if you're a Christian camp and you've got an abuser and he's very...
Which is the story you investigate.
Right. I spent 3 years investigating Kanakuk camps in Branson, Missouri. They had a bad guy. They decided to elevate their brand management over the truth on that. They still are. And so, and the GOP, instead of cleansing these elements out, like people like Donald Trump, who has now been held liable in court for rape, instead of getting rid of that or dealing with that honestly, they circle the wagons to protect the institution. And one of the things that I bring out in the book is there's a theologian in California named Curtis Chang, and he talks about how institutions, once they elevate this brand management over their original founding purposes, they're practicing idolatry. Mm-hmm. They're elevating something that they're worshiping that they should not be worshiping. And Curtis makes the point that when institutions do that, idols demand sacrifice, frequently women and children. And so you can see that happening. So like when a church is like, oh, we're just going to do brand management here, you can see women and children are hurt, and boys. In the Kanakuk camp example, hundreds of male campers were abused. And it's so insidious and so terrible. And so a part of this book is me wrangling with this institutional responsibility. And how do you live in a world where your institutions are betraying you and acting like they're not. Like, it's just, I'll never get over it. I don't know what to do about it, but
I think, they're probably, I don't know if people listening would think this, but they would say, well, sure, we know all the stuff that Trump did, but the reality, it's him versus Biden, for instance, or it was him versus Clinton, right? And, but the reality is that actually there were many choices that were made before deciding to ignore who Trump was and how inconsistent who he was to the conservative movement, or to become, like, how inconsistent it was with him becoming the Republican nominee. And yet all of these decisions were made to ignore it, to the point where, yes, the cost of outing him is just really, 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 really high. But they were all these opportunities before to do it, and people still didn't do it.
Right.
And I wonder why. What happened when I moved to the US in 99, right? Coming from France, I always thought it was quaint and cute, and I didn't quite understand how important it was. This kind of moral compass that American voters, especially Republican voters and conservative voters, seem to have when it came to electing people. Coming from France, I thought that the fact that having been exposed as having an affair was such a big deal to Americans were kind of cute and funny. I didn't realize actually that there were much bigger implications, that the moment you stop ignoring this, right, a lot of bad things happen. So what happened? How did we go? I mean, I've only been here 25 years. What happened between 99 and 2015, really? I mean, what do you think? When did Americans lose their moral compass, if it's the right way to say it? Maybe I'm being unfair, but
I don't know if you're being unfair, and I also don't know the answer. Here's why. I realize now, looking back, I don't think we really had a hold on our moral compass back then. Obviously, we didn't, and the reason I say that is because I really supported Romney back in 2005, 6, 7, 8. And we would talk to people, these evangelical leaders, about Governor Romney at the time, who obviously was a member of the Mormon church. And we would go to them and they'd say, oh, Nancy, no, we're so sorry. We're not going to get behind this guy because we have deeply held biblical beliefs and we can't support a Mormon. And so I would be like, okay, that makes sense. Let's talk about that. Let's reason through this scripturally. Let's pray about it. Let's look at the scriptures, like whatever. I did all of that for years. And then 5 minutes later, all of these people flipped immediately. These people with deeply held religious beliefs, and they supported Donald Trump. It does not make sense. Like, I cannot make sense of that. And I don't think that they were lying to me originally when they told me that they couldn't support Romney because of their deeply held biblical beliefs. I think they were just delusional. I don't think they had those beliefs. They definitely shed them 5 minutes later, but I do not know why. I do have a theory, and I'm sure you've heard this because David and I talk about this all the time. Once you get the lesser of two evils narrative in your head and you pull the trigger, you don't want to be on team lesser of two evil. So after you pull after you vote for Trump, eventually you're siding with him because you've saddled there. That's where you are. And so 6 months later, when there's a conflict politically, you have a tendency to defend the choice you made. And so it's sort of like the every Sunday school analogy where they try to tell you not to drink out of the red Solo cup that's being passed around at your high school party. After that first drink, it's easier to take the second. So I don't know. I don't have good answers on it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's kind of a puzzle. I mean, I just don't understand it either, but there's definitely this moment where there's this break where 1 minute, right? If anyone accuses you of being a witch, do you remember that story? You're out of the campaign trail. And I don't have enough memory of that episode to know whether that candidate, whether she was like actually a total cuckoo or whatever, but there may have been many more reasons to get rid of her. But and then the next minute, it's absolutely okay to, I don't know, to do all the stuff that Trump did, including to really not be a conservative or Republican by any way, shape, or form in a lot of ways. And so it's really kind of amazing. And then it's also amazing how then when you pick that guy, once he's the guy, then the entire institution lines up behind him. And that's when those who don't fall in line get the treatment that you received, which was really brutal. I remember reading David, write about it in National Review, but reading it in the book, they're just like essential things I had forgotten, including the horror that you went through with the things that people were saying about your daughter, Naomi. Can you talk about that?
Oh, man. Yeah. So when we opposed Trump, even though we had been Republicans our whole life, we dropped out of the party in 2016, I guess. In Tennessee, you don't really have to declare your allegiance. So there wasn't any dramatic like burning of the card or anything, but just emotionally, we made that break. Everyone was really mad at us. And so some people, white nationalists, went through my social media, got pictures of our daughter who's adopted from Ethiopia and plastered her face all over the internet in various horrible ways. Her in gas chambers with Donald Trump pulling the lever, her as an enslaved person in historical photos, just awful. So much worse than that. And yeah, so we were attacked in a lot of different ways, including, racially. Yeah. But the left, I spent my whole life sort of criticizing the left, like, oh, the left is unfair because they do this, this, and this. I had never experienced trauma until I crossed my own political party lines. I guess because it's so much worse because they considered me a traitor. But holy cow, the people that were criticizing us when we came out against Trump, the main thing that they did is they racialized and sexualized their insults. So they never talked to us about we might have a policy problem with something that Trump would say, and then they would flip it and they would sexualize it. They'd make a fake video of me in a sexual way, compromising way. And it's just like, wow, what do you do with this? Like, who are we dealing with? Like, what is this? This is weird.
And I was surprised. So in that part of the book, you talk a lot about the things that you learned through this process about your own country, but also about looking into the methods that you had used. For instance, you talk about how, you seem to be feeling kind of sorry for the fact that you yourself used extremely harsh languages to go after your opponent when you were writing as a ghost for a Republican fighting against a Democrat. And you expressed, but it can't be at that level. I mean, so do you really think that in a way you contributed to where we ended up now just because you weren't, you were aggressive at times? It seems
definitely. I feel that way. And I know that sounds sort of like I'm not that important that I can move the dial.
I know. I think you mean it in a bigger sense than that we were doing this.
Yeah, we were doing this and I was wrong. And I felt like it was important to say that very unequivocally because I did not have the right posture towards politics. We always grow up in church and it's like, oh, well, you should not, if you need money, you don't steal. Or if you fall in love with your secretary and you're married, you don't have sex with that person. Like there are biblical boundaries of morality, right? Mm-hmm. But then when it comes to politics, all bets are off. It's like, oh, politics ain't bing bag. Oh, this is a different dynamic. You have to really be harsh or lie or twist or whatever. And I bought into that. I grew up, with Ronald Reagan making fun of Tip O'Neill's weight. That's brutal. And I thought that was all done with a wink because back in the 80s it was. So like Ronald Reagan would make fun of Tip O'Neill and then after 6 o'clock they'd hang out and have drinks. when
Yeah,
Ronald Reagan was shot, Tip O'Neill was one of the first people in the hospital
you
room.
tell that story in your book.
Yeah. And it's like, you think, oh, well, we're just sort of jostling politically. And that's fine.
But also, I mean, we know of the horrible things that the founding fathers were, like the insults that they were throwing at each other, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, I hear you, but it does seem that now things are they're at a level. Here's the thing. Here's the reason why I want to push back a little bit. And obviously you're entitled to, to what you feel about the way you contributed, but there's a really big difference between the way things are now and things were, precisely because you could be brutal to each other about what you were saying to each other when you disagreed in the realm of politics. But in the end, you would still see the people behind it, right? You had these very strong friendship in politics. And I agree with you. I don't think there should not be a place for telling people in politics that mocking them because they're fat or this or that, no matter what the context. But in the end, it seemed that for a very long time in the history of the US, it did not affect our ability to see the other people are still human beings. And it seemed that we've lost that. We've lost that part. And obviously it's not as if I've studied this, I've really studied this, but I think look, I know people who just said, if you're Republicans, I can't be your friends anymore. If you're this, this is new, right? This idea that there are disagreements that are so profound that ultimately we can't even be friends. We can't even, and it puts you in a category that is just like so radically different than ours that seems different. And I don't know that this is your behavior that kind of was just the step towards this. I think it's something else radically that happened in our mindset. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah. And I don't know the answer to that because I was owning the libs back in, 2000 to 2015 or something. And I don't know what caused what, but I do know that I was not fair. Mm-hmm. I would take examples of something that a Democrat would do in Topeka, and I would make gross generalizations on that. And it just wasn't right. It just wasn't honest. I feel like it broke the 10 Commandments, specifically not bearing false witness against your neighbor. I felt like I was mischaracterizing people, my fellow Americans, and I got convicted over that. Mm-hmm. And I did not think that God gave me my writing talent to do that. So I think that's the message, sort of. I mean, I don't really have messages in the book that I hope people can take away. But one of the things that I think is true is we cannot control the culture, but we can control our own mouths. Mm-hmm. So I can't change the outcome of the political presidential election, but at least I can not be unfair to my neighbor. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just doubling down on my interpersonal relationships and trying to be honest and fair and kind to the people that I encounter in my normal life.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, I think this is definitely a good lesson. And I think politics would look very different if it weren't. But I think the problem is like now people believe that the stakes are so high. Politics has become such a big, big, big part of their lives that they think the stakes, an election, it's like it's a make or break election. Like somehow, when you listen to even like the Democrats right now, they tell you that it's the end of democracy if Trump is elected, and the Republicans are telling you that if the Democrats are elected, it's the end of our civilization altogether. So it's just like we kind of put politics at a level that is just so kind of, it's at the center of everything. And when I was reading the book, I was thinking, it was kind of reaffirming the fact that in a way I was really lucky to have always been in a position where first I was never political, but also I was never Republican or Democrat because I was a libertarian. And so I was just like the stakes of the election, just for me, it was just kind of I was just a loser every election anyway. So,
right.
So it was like, in a way it was but I want to talk about something else that I think runs through. Oh, before we do this, I wanna talk about like how you also learned through this about what it's like to be Black in America, because it seems that it's because of Naomi and what you saw while raising her that you fully started to comprehend that there are issues with in America, that there are things that you didn't see before.
Right. I'm embarrassed that I didn't see him before, to be completely honest,
Yes.
but I just didn't think that racism was the biggest deal in the world, in the current world, after Obama was elected. Like that's the thing that everyone says. Oh, well, we've had a Black president, so now everything is fine. And I sort of was like, I don't know. Like, I don't really see a ton of rampant racism in my life with my own two eyes. And I realized the reason I didn't see racism with my own two eyes is because it's not cool to be a racist amongst like white middle class people like we were. Or we are, like, it's not cool to just, be a complete racist out in public. But then when I adopted Naomi and I suddenly was constantly in the presence of someone who had darker skin, I could see it everywhere. And the reason I think this makes sense is because, let's say conservatively, 1 out of every 100 people are racist. If you're a white middle class person, you just never meet those people because it's never manifest. But if you're Black and you're just wandering around in the South and 1 out of every 100 people is a racist, you see it all the time. And so that was the shift. So I had 2 blonde-haired, blue-eyed, biological kids, and I would take them to our neighborhood pool and it would be normal. And then I had Naomi and I took her to the neighborhood pool. And I think on 3 different occasions, she was asked, do you belong here? Did you jump the fence? Can I see your bracelet? Where's your mother? And she behaviorally wasn't different.
And you talk also about the Nordstrom episode and
I was at Nordstrom and a cop approached Naomi and sort of accused her of shoplifting when all she was doing was obeying me, when I was checking out. And so I just was really ignorant about that. I did not understand what I didn't understand. And then when Naomi joined the family, and she's blessed our family in a million different ways, but one of the ways that she's blessed our families is she opened my eyes to like what was actually happening to Black Americans. I just didn't have that sort of understanding what was going on. And I'm sure I still don't because, I'm not Black, but at least I've been able to see a little bit of the world through Naomi's eyes.
Do you think that you can know what it's like until you have the experience? Because like you had a Black daughter, and because reading your book, I was reflecting on the fact that I think that there are things I'm overlooking, right? And it's interesting because it's not as hard for me to overlook when I look at France, because one of the things I came to the US and what I noticed is like for all the talks about racism in America, American Blacks are doing so much better than French Black people, right? So in my mind, that kind of translated rightly or wrongly with kind of maybe some of the feelings that you had, which was like, well, it's not as bad as people say. And it's because I would look in France and it's like, I never saw a Black doctor. And in the US, there were a lot of Black doctor head of, university. I mean, after all, as you said, there was an American Black president. There was like, and of course and so I kind of like, I took these signs and I just basically overlooked a lot of other things. But do you think we can truly, really learn something until something really opens your eyes? Or
yeah, I feel like people's eyes can be open just by reading books and finding like David's columns on race, I think have been interesting because you can see his shift on this. I think he wrote a column in National Review that is called Why I Changed My Mind About Police Brutality or something like that. Mm-hmm. I admire people like David for just admitting when they're wrong and changing opinions and explaining why. I think normal people can read that kind of thing and change their own opinions through education. But for some reason, maybe it was just laziness, ignorance, or arrogance. I just didn't even know I was wrong about, like I didn't even know what to investigate it until I started noticing that we had a major problem. And Naomi was the recipient of a lot of brutality, and she received a lot more than I think normal people would because of our positions culturally and how people were trying to attack us through her.
How old is she now?
16.
16. Is she aware that she's been the center of so much vitriol? This is not a strong word enough for the horror.
I think she's sort of aware. She's more interested in learning how to drive. She's getting her permit now. She's, concerned about school and things like that. So she's not overwhelmed culturally with, her role in the political discourse from several years ago. She's okay. And she's not completely connected to all that happened back then. But we did have to have some difficult conversations because, we thought at some point that her life, her physical safety was in danger. So we had to talk to the schools and stuff, but she's doing great. She's thriving. She's amazing.
This is great. Yeah, just, to close this conversation is just I think kind of in the last few years have really opened a lot of people's eyes. I still, will maintain that, there's something really just disturbing about the kind of racism that happens in European countries. But that had led me to really overlook some of the things that were happening in the U.S. Even though I think that the constitutional system we have is the best, I think, to address all of these problems. We have to live really truly by them. But it's really been an interesting ride the last, 5, 6, 7, 8 years for sure. I want to talk to you now about guilt. It's also another theme that I think runs through the book. And I think it was interesting to me because I've always said that it is something I just don't like about guilt, because in a lot of ways, people feel guilty when they've done something that they shouldn't be doing and they know it, and then they feel guilty. And your book kind of made me realize that this was such a kind of narrow and kind of way of thinking about guilt. But the thing that was striking is how fast you were from the moment you were a child to even in adulthood of actually kind of really thinking things were your fault.
Right.
Whether it was in the case of sexual abuse, even with your friend Victoria, you had this horrendous story with that boyfriend who tried to kill you and then said he was going to kill himself. He ended up killing himself later on, right? This is why it was I just couldn't believe how much you had survived and gone through but it's just you carried this guilt with you, or you were so fast to believe that it was your fault, that everything was your fault, even Victoria's death, because you had this dream and you hadn't said, and you, even with the political stuff, right? You immediately see your role in the punishment that you seem to be getting. Can you talk about this a little?
I don't know if this is just a result of my theology, and it has to be, because when I grew up in the church, your salvation was so tenuous, you could lose it in a second. And if you had any sin, you could go straight to hell. And so it sounds so unsophisticated spiritually, but I used to think that if I told a lie and then I died on the way home, I would just go straight to hell. And there was nothing you could do because I was sinning all the time. I was very cognizant of the fact that I was sinning. I might say a cuss word, or I might have hit my sister or whatever. And so I was just constantly on the brink of going to hell. And so when you're taught that theology, and that's a very unique theology specific to the Church of Christ, circa 1985 through 2000. I don't know. I don't know. I know that there are some churches still like this, but it was very unique to us. And it was a very small sect. And I just constantly thought I was going to hell. So I know that there are theological ramifications of that in my life emotionally, because I was always terrified that I would do something wrong and I would go to hell and there would be nothing I could do about it. And I guess I just carried that with me. I still am untangling that, I think.
But if you know you're going to hell, then what's the, I mean, you can only go to hell once, right? I mean,
Yeah,
how come it doesn't give you an incentive to just throw it all away and say, well, I'm going to hell anyway. I might as well smoke and have sex and do all the things I'm not supposed to do because I'm already going to hell. It
that's
seems to
right.
me that it's kind of interesting that on one hand, it's like you think you're going to hell all the time, but it doesn't give you an incentive to misbehave. When for me, I would have been, you know what? I'm already going to hell, so I might as well throw it all away.
Yeah, go in
So
style, baby. Yeah, no, that's what happened to me. Also, that's a big part of the sexual purity culture lie is they say, oh, you're already ruined and you're 12. So good luck. You can't get that back. And I think that's what happened with me. It just put me because I couldn't fix it. So I just was set on a path of making really terrible decisions over and over and over. And so my life took a very bad turn until I met David, and then everything switched back. So like the book is like the first part of the book is like trauma, trauma, trauma. And then David French shows up and then it's like, wait, what?
yeah, no, I mean, so this, I mean, I don't want to give readers like a listener a bad impression. This book is funny. I mean, it's like, you won't believe everything that happens to Nancy. You just will be like, what? I mean, it's incredible. In a traumatic way. I thought a lot when I was reading your book, who would I be had I gone through what you've gone through? And I think I can say almost for sure that I wouldn't be who you are now. I'd be like, I would have been pregnant at 13, a drug addict. I mean, I'm reading this and I'm just thinking, who would I have? But so it's all a lot of trauma, but it's also a funny book. I mean, there's just so many moments where I was just laughing. The story about you lying to the Romney to go skiing when you've never skied. And here you are with the all Olympics, gear. And you're like, and you can't ski. Anyway, it's also just a beautiful love story. And it's a love story that starts long before you're at this Christian college, well, maybe not long before, but a few years before you're at this Christian college where he went and where you have gone, you're just not going to school. You're traumatized by all sorts of things, including the loss of your best friend. And you're just saying, what the hell, I'm just like, and you meet him in person finally in front of that. But that love story starts before that because with a phone call. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So this does not reflect well on me, but my parents were forcing me to go to this Church of Christ college in Nashville called David Lipscomb University. And David French actually teaches there now. So, but it's a Church of Christ school, and the Church of Christ at the time, we were the only people going to heaven, obviously, and not many of us were going. And so you had to go where the Church of Christ was. And so that was the college that my parents would pay for. So I reluctantly was going to this college, and they would have people call me like admissions volunteers. And they'd be like, oh my gosh, we're so excited. They're going to Lipscomb. Are you so excited? And I would just make up lies because I wasn't excited and I didn't have anything to say, but I just wanted to be a jerk. And so I would say, well, I can't get into a good veterinarian school or med school or law school after going to Lipscomb. So no, I'm not very excited. I just made up crap. I made it up a different lie every week. By the time I got to the law school ruse, someone called my bluff. And the guy who had called me said, well, my friend David French just got into Harvard Law School. Is that good enough for you? And I was like, well, Harvard was one of the places I was considering. Now, I could not spell Harvard. I didn't even want to go to law school. I didn't know anything about it. And he was like,
yeah, you were pushing their buttons.
Yeah, I was just being a complete jerk. And I was like 18 from West Tennessee. There's no telling how stupid I sounded, but I went to the public library. I read about Harvard Law School. By the time David French called me, I knew everything I could possibly know, gleaned from the Paris, Tennessee library. So I tried to sound smart. But when he called me, he was amazing. And we talked for like an hour, and I just fell in love with this guy. Now, he was 6 years older than me. He was engaged to someone else. He was in Boston. Obviously, there was no romantic possibility there. But I fell in love with this guy. I was like, I could talk to him forever and never get tired of it. Fast forward several years, I ended up going to the school and I disliked it as much as I had anticipated. David had graduated from Harvard Law School and he was walking down the sidewalk because the school had a constitutional issue and they'd hired David to help him with that. And so when I saw him, I introduced myself in person and I was sort of snarky and awful. And I was like, oh, you encouraged me to go to the school and I hate it. All of that reflected poorly on me because I was not living the kind of life that I should have been living at the time. Perhaps it wasn't a reflection on the school, but I was horrible, even snarky when I met him. And he was like, we talked for 4 hours on the sidewalk.
On the sidewalk.
And by that time, he'd already broken up with the other person that he was engaged to. So that wasn't a complication. So at the end of that conversation, he asked me out and we were married within 3 months, much to my parents.
Well, you were engaged within 3 weeks, right?
Yes, engaged. And honestly, by the second date, I decided I would marry him. I didn't tell him that, but we moved fast. And how did you like our Paris wedding? Was that so funny?
So
to you?
I thought, do you know what I thought? I was so impressed.
Yeah?
If I wanted to do this, not knowing a country, I don't know what I would do. I'd be like, I was reading this and I was like, how did they pull it off? Because one of the conditions so David proposes in a not so romantic place out on a walk after visiting his grandmother, right? You guys were like in front of some pipes or whatever.
Like a sewage pipe or something.
Sewage pipe or something. I mean, it makes for a good story. And then you say, yes, but I have 2 conditions. I want to live in New York City and I want to get married in Paris.
Right.
That's like not small conditions.
No.
And, but he was like, okay, sure. And you did it. And I was just like, and you managed to transport all these people. I mean, I was just very impressed. Very impressed.
Well, let me say this. Okay. I was from rural Tennessee. I didn't know anything about France, even though I grew up in Paris, Tennessee, and we had our own Eiffel Tower that was 60 feet tall. I did not know anything about New York. I had only seen movies like Sleepless in Seattle, Muppets Take Manhattan, that type of thing.
Yeah.
So when David proposed, because he was Mr. Fancy Pants Harvard Law person, I thought that that's the type of thing that Harvard Law grads would expect in a future wife. Like, oh, well, yeah, we need to get married in France. I made all that up. So like, I didn't know. I just knew that like, what's the platonic form of romance? Well, Paris, obviously. What's the coolest place? Where's the coolest place to live? Well, New York. I just pulled that out of my head.
And he came through.
He came through.
It came through. And it's a beautiful, it's a really beautiful love story. I mean, this book, it's not that long. I think it took me like 3 days to read it. And it has, let me check. It has, 200, do you know how many pages it has? 260?
No, I think it's about 90,000 words, I think.
Yeah. So it has, let me check right now, 263 pages and then notes, right? It's a small, and the amount of stuff that happens in there. And I'm sure there are miracles. There's a love story. They're like, it's just sex abuse. There's crimes, political scandals. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. And I've recommended it already to a lot of people because I want people to read this. And I know, again, you've always come across to me as someone that seems happy for what it's worth. And I just want, this is to me a book about survival, but survival in the right way. It's kind of, you don't say, through the power of positive thinking, I'm going to get through this. No, you totally indulge in the kind of, I hate this. I'm going to throw it all away. And then at some point, there's the love story in a way, David, kind of maybe pull you out from this darkness. But the entire rest of the story remains a story of progress, a story of redemption, a story of still healing. And it's just, I think it's a really great book.
Oh, well, thank you so much for saying that. I really struggled with what to include. Believe it or not, those are just the highlights.
Yeah, no, I can imagine.
Yeah, but yeah, and I at one point I think the book was 140,000 words. It's down to 90. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot more that has happened, but I just wanted to tell the story for anyone in America who feels sort of like politically, culturally, spiritually homeless during these weird times. I just sort of wanted them to realize that they're not actually alone, that there's a bunch of us that are out there that
Yeah.
feel the same way.
But actually, that reminds me, I have a last question, and you call it Ghosted, an American Story. But do you think, I mean, there are obviously some aspects of this, especially the religious aspect of it, and the way, I mean, especially Church of Christ. I mean, they're not everywhere. That very American, but I think it's not a uniquely American story in a way.
Yeah, you're probably right about that. I think they chose that subtitle
I mean, I
because
like it, but
yeah. No, but I think you're right about that because I think they chose the subtitle because of how the story interweaves with all the various political machinations. I was like the Forrest Gump of politics. I was just like everywhere. But I think you're right about that. I think it's a universal story of being rejected by people who should support you and love you and protect you. And I
Yeah.
feel like everybody has that experience.
I mean, and I don't know if anyone actually, there are a lot of people who actually never stand up against the institutions that they belong to. But for those, I think it is very sadly, it's probably a very universal, this idea of institutions being protected above all else is sadly a very very common story. But anyway, I recommend, I know for my listener, it's a very different interview because, we didn't talk about economics. We didn't even really talk about politics, but I just really like this book. So I just wanted to talk to you. And this was a good excuse to talk to you.
Oh, we're so sweet. Well, I mentioned this previously, but I'm glad I did not offer any financial advice because I do admit in the book that I have bounced some tithe checks. So I'm probably not the right guest for this podcast typically.
No. I mean, it was great. So the book just came out. And so I would recommend that people read it. And good luck with everything, Nancy.
Thank you so much.